domestic policy. Like, obviously a lot of your platform issues, since you're running for governor, have to do with domestic affairs, but having had so much experience in Mexico, you being born in Mexico, you seem to know quite a bit about that too, which is a good thing. So I'm going to ask you a foreign policy question and a domestic policy question, because I think we can agree that even as part of the United States, that because of the 10th Amendment and such, Texas still does have its sovereignty and is affected by a lot of international issues. So the first question that I want to ask, this is a foreign one, is how can Texas shield itself from threats to dollar hegemony? Because in the status quo, what we have is a system where, because the world oil markets are priced in dollars, that there's a lot of artificial demand for that, and that we're able to run massive trade and budget deficits that normally would sink an economy within just a few $1 trillion, let alone what we have. But because of the rise of other currency systems, as reserve currencies like China, as well as the aversion to trade surpluses by the two major parties, I know as a libertarian you're probably in favor of free markets, so maybe against some of these tariffs. What measures do you think Texas can take to make sure that its economy is able to stand strong, even in a situation where the dollar on which we depend is in so much risk?
And I'm glad you asked that, because and now I'm going to have nightmares, because I happen to know how volatile our dollar is. And I don't wish to give anyone nightmares, but if oil stopped selling in dollars, excuse the language, we would be so screwed. The only thing that is keeping the dollar strong is a deal that was made by Kissinger with the OPEC nations, that the only way that you could buy or sell oil was on the dollar. And the OPEC nations agreed to buy US bonds. So the US dollar was taken off of the gold standard, and now basically we're on the oil standard, and that's probably a little bit simplistic. But when the reality of some of the Middle East wars is because one of the realities is because Saddam Hussein threatened to sell oil not in dollars. And that is what is going on again, is some of these countries threaten to sell oil not in dollars. And that affects the United States, because all of a sudden, one of the biggest commodities in the world is the US dollar, because people need it to buy oil, and that is what they trade in. So if that, believe me, when I think about it enough, I get nightmares, but hopefully there will be a transition. Now, we need to allow other types of currencies. We need to allow cryptocurrencies, and they will go up and down, and believe me, people are going to lose their shorts up and down on the fluctuation of that. But that's theirs to lose. But we definitely need to allow other currencies that we can rely on and trade on other than the dollar.
Yeah, and that's definitely an interesting concept these days, especially with cryptocurrencies, because a lot of, when you're talking about other countries' currency, there's a lot of concerns about that. But when we talk about cryptocurrency, something that's not really held by any specific entity.
Nope. Yeah, nobody controls it except the free market.
I think that's what's really interesting. And in the free market, I mean, that's what libertarian economics is about. And that kind of brings me a little bit into the next question, because it's a more domestic focused thing. It's not purely economic necessarily, but it has to do a little bit with economics and sort of its extended effects. So I'm going to kind of bring the education issue back up. And you talk about how you want to reform education, not increase spending. One of the problems that we have right now with education is not just the stuff that you've mentioned, or the stuff that was brought up in the question, but also inequality. That the schools that get the most money are the ones that already have the most. Now, I know as a libertarian, you're probably not a fan of taxes, which is where we might, in general, I know you recognize them as a necessary evil. And part of the problem has to do with property taxes, and because of property valuations that enforces the inequality. So my question is, from a policy perspective, what sort of tax reforms would you see as helpful in dealing with some of the problems with education? How would you be able to make education funding more equal and more equitable on a per student basis in order to allow a level playing field without necessarily having to push spending through the roof?
Whenever the government gets involved in things that they tend to just basically run amok, and they create and compound these problems. That the Constitution of Texas that dictates that the state provide education has been amended so many times it's unrecognizable. And they just keep compounding the situation. And as I probably mentioned earlier, and you all should appreciate this, Albert Einstein, I believe is what he says, said that he didn't say it, but whatever, it sounds good. That we cannot solve problems with the same mindset that created them. For us to think that the R's and D's or the legislature, shall we call it, can solve these problems, I've got to tell you, they are mentally and physically incapable of, because of their mindset. Their mindset is to dump more money at it. Their mindset is to not play fair with the big universities and the small universities. The thing is here is a lot of people that who here is worried about when you graduate that you'll have a job? That's pretty much everybody would. A lot of people that they're very worried that when they graduate they'll have a job. Who here has student loan? Do you realize that'll be with you for the rest of your life until you pay it off? It'll probably be your biggest debt that you'll ever have, other than maybe a mortgage. And why is student loans, let me back up. Colleges are getting more and more and more expensive because student loans are getting more and more and more accessible. And student loans are getting more and more and more accessible because the government dictated that you cannot bankrupt a student loan. The only thing that you cannot bankrupt is the IRS for a student loan. That's ridiculous. That's insane. The schools and whoever gave you that loan should share the risk of that loan. So, is what I'm getting at is that same mindset that keeps compounding the things, we have to say stop. Let's reanalyze, like I was saying, let's reanalyze our education system. Let's even reanalyze what we are teaching. We need for the market to tell us what they need, because the universities are the orchards that the market will harvest from. That's where they get their fruit. That's where they get their workers. That's where they get their brains. That's where they get their next Einsteins. That's where they get their next Jobs. That's where they get their next Bill Gates. That's where the new ideas come from. So we have to have a real question, not about how do we solve the funding issue or how do we solve the inequality issue. We have to get right down to how do we solve education. There has been some studies actually done that for what you pay for 1 year of college can get you from kindergarten all the way through to college, to the end of college, if you have alternative methods of teaching. Now, I'm not talking housing and food and all that other stuff. I'm talking the education system itself.
Yeah, but I think, and this will be the last things that I want to go over time, but I think that sort of dodges the question a little bit, because I understand all those things, and I agree with you that we need education reform, totally, you're absolutely right on that. But the thing is that you cannot deny that with the current system, that when you have these massive inequalities in funding, it's something that is creating problems. Like, you talk about the free market. Part of that is, what that entails is limiting wealth redistribution. What we have right now is essentially wealth redistribution from poor to rich. that we have a system that gives the wealthy all the advantages and that the poor kids are stuck with the short end of the stick because it's difficult for them to get the same amount of funding in terms of resource allocation. So my question is, because this is a broad problem, and there's no silver bullet, it's going to be more of a silver shotgun. There's going to be a lot of solutions, and you talked about some of them. But what can we do to solve the inequality issue at the state level? How can we reform this, even if it's not perfect, it's still better than what we have now?
I'm open for suggestions. And I am not ashamed to say that. I am but one man. And I have told a lot of people, I'm running for governor, not Merlin. And it is an issue that needs to be addressed, but it takes bold leaders to admit that it's an issue, and let's get the right people addressing it. I recognize the problem, but I would be lying to you if I started pulling stuff out of my head saying, well, let's try to, no. There are other people that are much more focused on that issue that can solve it, but let's get those people to solve it.
Yeah, so, and that's a good thing, even though it doesn't completely answer, like the fact that you're willing to have that input, is an important thing. And I think for the sake of time, I'll definitely go ahead and open it up to the next person. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful
Appreciate it.
dialogue.